words you mentioned about me, but let me try. Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon, and thank you very much for sharing your time with us this afternoon. My objective will be to briefly present you the macroeconomic situation in Macedonia and summarize in 10 lines why we think Macedonia is a good destination for investors. Let me start by summing up on some of the things the Prime Minister mentioned about key macroeconomic indicators. Macedonia is a country which definitely has solid macroeconomic fundamentals, and you can see that we are one of the few countries in Europe that has maintained stability over the last 4 years, the years of economic crisis in Europe. This is reflected in all economic indicators, including growth, where most of the countries in Europe have been in recession. Macedonia, in 3 out of 4 years, has achieved solid rates of growth. Even in 2010 and 2011, our growth rate was around 3%, which is a good achievement given what was happening in the neighborhood and the fact that we are basically exporting to Europe more than 2/3 of our products. This was mainly driven by solid export growth rate of in some years it was at a level of 29–30%. In the last 2 years, export was also driven by the companies which are operating in free economic zones. So some of the companies that were mentioned have contributed a lot to these results in terms of growth and GDP growth, in terms of export and GDP growth. FDI have been solid before the crisis in the magnitude of 6–8% of GDP. Of course, because of the crisis, there was lower inflow of foreign investments, but still it's solid given what's happening in other countries in Europe, and we think that we can achieve much more once the European crisis is over. Macedonia has also very low inflation. It was stable around 2% annually over the last 10 years. So it's not only this government, all governments basically have respected price stability as one of the major preconditions for growth, and that's the result. Our solid macroeconomic fundamentals have been confirmed by major credit rating agencies in the world. Standard & Poor's and Fitch have confirmed in the last 3 years unchanged rating of Republic of Macedonia, BB+, with stable outlook. And this is exception. This is not a case which you will find in other countries in Europe, where their ratings have been reduced, as you know, a couple of times, in some occasions by 3 or 4 notches. In the case of Macedonia, because of the stability, we have our rating was confirmed a couple of times in the last couple of years. The financial sector is very important in terms of stability, and our financial sector had no spillover effects of the financial crisis. Why? Because banks were relying mainly on domestic deposits, domestic savings, not on foreign savings in order to finance their credit activity, and they are fairly conservative in their policies and monitored adequately by the central bank. There are 17 banks in Macedonia, 3/4 of them are with foreign capital, and there are a number of banks, global banks, which are operating in Macedonia. Prudent fiscal policy is the cornerstone of our macroeconomic stability, and we are proud to say that our budget has been in good order over the crisis, and we have one of the lowest budget deficits in Europe. It's 2.5% of GDP, where most of the countries in the neighborhood and in Europe have budget deficits of 7, 8, 10% and higher. And this has enabled us to keep our debt at a sustainable level. keeping the debt at sustainable level probably was not the most important thing 5 years ago to be mentioned, but nowadays when most of the countries in Europe and elsewhere are suffering from high debt and unsustainable debt position, we think this should be emphasized because Macedonia with 29% of GDP, with our debt at 29% of GDP, certainly shows that there are countries which have implemented prudent fiscal policies and have been very cautious in borrowing from abroad. When you think about Macedonia, aside from the stability, you should also think about Macedonia as a country with low costs. In particular, this is reflected in taxes, in the area of taxes. We have lowest taxes in Europe, basically the most attractive tax package in Europe. The average tax on profit is 10%. However, as explained before, if companies are not distributing their profit into dividends, they are paying zero effective rate. So basically all companies that are reinvesting their profit or are retaining their profit are not paying any tax on the profit, and income tax is 10%, which overall gives companies a very favorable environment in terms of taxes. There are additional tax incentives and other incentives in the free economic zones, which will be discussed by the director of the free economic zones. I just want to mention that we have also reduced social contribution rates, payroll taxes, in order also to reduce the cost for the companies. And we have introduced online tax payments and simplified tax procedures, which is also cutting on red tape and bureaucracy, and also is very helpful to businesses. In addition to the taxes, we have reformed in many areas in order to create better business conditions for companies. For example, a company could be established in 4 hours in Macedonia, could be registered and start with operations in only 4 hours. We have introduced various one-stop shops for different services, for custom services and other, in order to reduce bureaucracy and also to enable companies to spend less time in obtaining licenses, permits, and dealing with the government, and more time in their business plans. Our labor legislation is very flexible. It's relatively easy to hire and fire workers based on the business conditions and the business cycle and the decision of the companies. So it's a very modern legislation, which is also attractive for the investors. In terms of the real estate market, foreigners can purchase real estate and construction land in Macedonia, while agricultural land could be obtained for lease. And we have significantly also simplified procedures for obtaining construction permits in order to make it easier for companies who want to start or invest. You can see how others are ranking these reforms in Macedonia and how they are ranking Macedonia. It's not the government that should speak about itself and its work, it's also what others are speaking about Macedonia. In the last 6 years, Macedonia has constantly been among the top reformers in the world on the basis of the assessment of the Doing Business report, which is the most relevant report prepared by the World Bank professionals in the world. We have been ranked as the 3rd best reformer last year and overall, and we've been 6th in the world in the ease of starting a business, 17th in the world in protecting investors. We have been at the 4th place in the world related to the tax rate, and so on and so forth, which overall should give you an impression about the overall assessment of rating agencies and international financial institutions about Macedonia, and that's explaining basically the increased interest of investors about Macedonia. If you take a look at the first slide, the first graph, you will see that from 2006, when this government took into power, in these 6 years, we have improved the ranking of our country from 94th position in the world to 22nd just for those who are not familiar with these rankings, is a position which belongs to OECD countries, perhaps like Canada and other countries which are developed, and not countries like Macedonia, which are emerging or which are, for example, our neighbors, Bulgaria, Serbia, they are placed on 50, 60, 70, 80 position. Some of them, for example, are Greece is 109 position in the world, and we are 22nd, and we are of course proud to emphasize this, not because of other things, but just to tell the world that although we are neighbors, we are performing much better, and we are a completely different case in terms of investors, and they should look at us as a completely different and more successful case. And it's not only doing business, it's also Forbes magazine and Heritage Foundation and others who are also ranking favorably Macedonia. One of the disadvantages of a small country such as Macedonia, which is landlocked, is the small size of the market. How one can compensate for that or overcome this problem? By signing free trade agreements with all countries in Europe and other countries, we have expanded the potential market to 650 million consumers, which means the companies which are operating in Macedonia can use these free trade agreements for exporting their goods produced in Macedonia to a market of 650 million people without paying any customs duties. Education is one of the areas where the government is investing a lot. We have increased education budget to 5 to 6% of GDP, which is at the level of OECD countries. We have introduced various changes in all levels of education. For example, in the primary education, kids are learning 2 foreign languages, one in the 1st grade, the second one in the 6th grade. We have introduced entrepreneurship as a subject, and we have introduced mandatory secondary education and also tertiary education at universities. We have provided free textbooks, and students can also learn from we have translated basically the best textbooks which are used in top 100 world universities and translated them in Macedonian, so students in Macedonia can use these textbooks. And we have also opened 2 new universities with campuses in many cities in Macedonia, so that we made education more affordable for those parents who cannot afford, who cannot send their kids to the capital. So the enrollment rate, what are the results? The enrollment rate from secondary to level to university is 99%. Of course, not all of them are finishing university. Perhaps 2/3 are finishing, but still it's high percent. In summary, I would like to thank you for your attention, and in case there is any need for additional explanation on the issues I mentioned, I will be glad to answer your questions, but also my colleagues will be able to cover some other areas. Thank you.